the alarm bells have only grown louder in a world battered by extreme weather events. Can countries live up to their promises? In Glasgow, they face their last chance to rein in global warming. 196 nations, 12 days, one crucial climate summit to decide on the future of the planet. Welcome to this special COP26 edition of Down to Earth. As they gather in Scotland, leaders face an urgent task, keeping the goal of 1.5 degrees of warming within reach. But so far, the world is lagging behind. Antonia Kerrigan has this report on what's at stake.
6%.
Climate ambitions are now the stuff of global grandstanding among leaders. And as floods and wildfires ravage many countries this summer, COP26 is crunch time.
I have always been clear that in Glasgow, the world must deliver an outcome which keeps 1.5 degrees in reach.
To this end, signatories of the Paris Accords are supposed to announce new commitments every 5 years, each upping the ante on those before. COP26, which was due to take place in 2020, is the first test of this so-called ratchet mechanism. Many, though, are falling short on already inadequate targets. Policies already in place will see the global temperature rise by 2.9 degrees this century. And let's say all NDCs are fulfilled, warming will still reach 2.4 degrees. And as the developing world is painfully aware, promises are only as good as the governments making them. In 2009, rich countries promised $100 billion a year in climate finance and have consistently come up 20 billion short. An ongoing sore point and a likely hot potato at this year's summit.
The time for talk is over. Now is the time for action. There have been too many promises made.
For nearly 2 years, the pandemic has stolen the limelight from the climate crisis. But now, all eyes are on Glasgow.
It's the latest climate buzzword, carbon neutrality. Think of it as a scale with CO2 emissions weighing heavily on one side, generated by the transport sector, factories and energy production, balanced by CO2 emissions sucked out of the atmosphere, thanks to natural carbon sinks, but also carbon offsets, such as tree planting schemes and carbon capture technology. It's an ambitious and necessary goal. Scientists warning we must reach net zero emissions by 2050 to avert climate chaos. Both countries and companies have eagerly jumped on the carbon neutrality bandwagon, including world powers and dirty industries. But with a deadline so far out in the future, net zero plans are easy to embrace, but even easier to neglect. And unless countries hit their 2030 targets first, carbon neutrality is at risk of becoming just another empty slogan. To talk more about what we can expect from COP26, I'm joined now by Lola Vallejo, Climate Program Director at the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. Thank you very much for being here today. We know that we need to cut CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030, but we also know that CO2 emissions are on the rise after the COVID-19 pandemic. Is it counterproductive to set ourselves objectives that are almost unattainable?
There are two things that you need to distinguish. First, yes, we've seen a rebound of CO2 emissions following the COVID crisis, simply because the COVID crisis has just put a temporary stop on emissions, or actually mitigated some of them. However, we need structural changes to really reform our economies and transform our sectoral emissions to go to a net zero world. So far, if you take stock of the country pledges put on the table, as the UN has done, we see that we're still far off the mark. Instead of 45% reduction by 2030 on 2010 levels, we're now on track to a 15% increase. So this is a huge gap to narrow, and it's very likely that even at the end of COP, we won't have completely narrowed down that gap. What matters is that we have made a big enough dent in this gap so that countries still feel motivated to keep participating in the multilateral process.
Whether countries can fulfill their net zero promises depends on how fast they can move away from fossil fuels. The objective at COP26 will be to consign coal power to history. That goal, however, seems more uncertain than ever, as China has been sending the world mixed signals about its relationship with coal.
Coal is China's main source of energy, powering nearly 60% of the country's economy. Thanks to its reliance on the fossil fuel, China is also the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases and has been for more than a decade. But in a policy shift, Beijing announced last month it would stop funding coal projects in the developing world as part of its ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, and would instead provide funds for renewable energy projects.
This is precisely why the Chinese announcement is important. It is saying, as one of the largest overseas public financier, we're now going to put more money on coal. And this will be a very important signal to the whole market, including to most of the private sector players.
But China continues to invest in coal at home. Last year, 38.4 gigawatts of coal-fired energy was brought online. That's more than 3 times the global total. Add to that China's current energy crunch, rolling blackouts in key regions that have left some factories and households without power for days. To tackle the crisis, Beijing has ordered its mines to ramp up coal production. The concern now is, will China stick to its climate goals?
The message from the international community has to be clear that China's emissions have to peak as soon as possible, and there's no way that a continued increase in emissions until late in this decade is compatible with the Paris Agreement.
As China transitions to greener energy alternatives, the country's mining provinces worry about what the future holds for them.
We heard in that report just now that China is having a hard time kicking its addiction to coal. Can China's stance on coal derail COP26?
First, I'd like to take a moment to celebrate the fact that China's announcement on coal abroad is already a huge step forward, as China was the largest funder of coal overseas, and China is the first non-developed country to make that stance. Now, of course, China is also the biggest extractor and consumer of coal for its domestic use, and currently China has only committed to stopping the growth of coal domestically, but it still hasn't provided any detail as to how and by when it plans to reduce its use. So China knows that it has a huge challenge ahead of itself, but it's trying to navigate troubled waters and to meet both the energy security challenge in the short term, while also renewing its commitment to sustainability in the long term. And the 2030 commitment that China will put on the table at COP will be the biggest credibility tests that China will have to face on the international stage.
What are the other sticking points that could make or break COP26 in your opinion?
The Paris Agreement is a complex agreement that has a lot of rules that need to be agreed in its implementation. One of them relates to international carbon markets. That is, how can one country going above and beyond their commitments sell off credits and make money from this and sell it to a country that isn't meeting their climate targets. We have to agree these rules, and it's very important to do so in a robust manner to avoid double counting and ultimately missing the point of the whole Paris Agreement. So this is the third time that countries are going to come together and try to agree those rules. This has failed in the last 2 COPs, and COP26 is going to be a milestone for that as well.
What if we fail again? What if COP26 fails?
If we had a failure on the rules for the international carbon markets, that would not necessarily be such a bad thing. I think countries collectively at the last 2 COPs took the decision that it was better to have no rules at all rather than to have rules that would undermine the whole point of the Paris Agreement itself. Now, in terms of solidarity, I think that is the real risk of this COP. COVID has hurt a lot of economies, and we've seen incredible inequalities both in terms of vaccine distribution and in terms of capacities to face the worst economic impacts of the COVID crisis. So this COP is going to be a key test for multilateral cooperation, and probably a moment to also rethink the basis for that cooperation.
Is COP26 our final chance to avert the worst consequences of climate change, in your opinion?
What you answer to that question depends on your perspective on life. But to put it shortly, we have to do everything we can to starve off the worst impacts of climate change. And as the IPCC has said, every year matters, every tenth of degree matters, so every effort matters. Of course, we should be doing our maximum, but it's not because we won't completely close the gap at this COP that we should just stop fighting. We need to keep on applying pressure to governments, not only to increase the commitments, but especially to encourage them to meet those commitments, because the key challenge will be in the implementation. And many governments which have taken very ambitious goals, especially in the long term to 2050 or 2060, still are wondering, how am I going to put my economy and my society on track to a net zero world? So that's the main challenge that every society is confronted with today.
Lola Vallejo, many thanks for your analysis and thanks for watching. Do stay tuned to France 24 and our special coverage of COP26.